Hi everyone. Welcome to this paper called Ragnarök, God-Sized Microaggressions and Cosmic Body Horror. And it's based on a workshop I did as part of Kingston University's Festival of the Story, celebrating storytelling traditions, fiction, poetry, and performance. A big thank you to Dr. Kate Scott for including me in the event. And the event was also organised by the collective, the Writing Cultures Collective at Kingston University, which Kate also co-chairs. This is also the group where my project on the Infinity Stones that you see on this channel began. It began with the work I did on Ant-Man to think about racial microaggressions differently and via those size-based metaphors in those texts. This paper is one among a few I've done using social science and pop culture to think about the Marvel Infinity Stones as a vehicle to extract metaphors of oppression, and I'll explain what the Infinity Stones are in a minute. I came to use art as a way to get to grips with ideas I struggled to understand when written in many, I guess, more formal academic contexts, like journal articles, for example. And I came to Elizabeth Freeman's work on Monsters Inc. actually. So her paper Monsters Inc. notes the neoliberal arts education, and where she writes the humanities are a shock to the common sense, the estranging move that will always make what we do unintelligible and incalculable, and that may release or catalyze enough energy to blow out a few institutional fuses. So the thinking behind it, so fiction as vehicle for understanding different ideas, is not new at all. Elizabeth Freeman follows Lauren Ballant's counter-politics of the silly object, and was also predated by Stuart Hall, who believed popular culture as a struggle between the powerful and the rest of society. He believed that cultural texts were a double movement of containment and resistance, reflective of dreams and aspirations, and also more critically, evidence of a relationship between the public and dominant power relations, like how the establishment influence what gets mass produced. In 2011, academic Jack Halberstam, in his book The Queer Art of Failure, wrote that the silly archive allows me to make claims for alternatives that are markedly different from the claims that are made in relation to high cultural archives. The texts that I prefer here do not make us different or different make us prefer here do not make us better people or liberate us from the culture industry, but they might offer strange and anti-capitalist logics of being and acting and low theory knowing, and they will harbour covert and overt queer worlds. I believe in low theory in popular places, in the small, the inconsequential, the anti-monumental, the micro, the irrelevant. Or some may say, how can you use a company engineered by corporate capitalism for, dare I say, social justice work or work to make us liberate our minds or think differently? I am looking for more quirky ways to think. What images can we conjure of racism at a microscopic level? What do the effects of microaggressions look like beyond the naked eye? So first off, I began with Ant-Man, as I said just a moment ago, and Ant-Man with the Reality Stone. But if you're familiar with the MCU, the Reality Stone wasn't actually in the Ant-Man films in that way. The Reality Stone started with the Thor films, but I think I preferred the Ant-Man films, so I chose to just mix it up a little bit in that sense. And I began to think how the Reality Stone could be thought about as a metaphor for how racism or racial microaggressions warp realities, and I did that through bringing the Reality Stone in conversation with other scholars as well. Later, at November 2024's Comics Forum Symposium in Leeds, I used texts including WandaVision, Doctor Strange, and Ms. Marvel, and the Time Stone to consider how racial microaggressions warp perceptions of time, necessitating mental illness. This paper brought in scholar Frantz Fanon's links between colonial racism and mental illness of the 60s. And I also bring in Charles Mills's ideas of racial time, and what and that paper takes microaggressions to be the micro-colonial terrorism um, at a, in the everyday form, in that sense. So boxed up into the everyday. In December, December 2024, I went back to writing cultures, offering up part three in my Infinity Stones synthesis, which was on the space stone known as the Tesseract, which in the MCU can transport people across um, space, and it can also manipulate space. I began to think about the ways exposure to racial microaggressions might manipulate consciousness, like when you sleep, and at rest, we might travel to meet and talk with ancestors who, according to physicists, might be out there somewhere as well. For example, in the work of Albert Einstein, here below, and also Sabine Hossenfeld, who talks about a block universe, according to physicists, where here the future, present, and past exist in the same way. So you could come to the conclusion: did our ancestors ever truly die as well? So there's a lot of those more like philosophical questions being had there too. So it's possible our ancestors still live somewhere, and for many Black people, they do. Further, culturally mandated. For example, in the 80s and 90s, Black feminists like Alice Walker and Toni Morrison talked about how conversations with their ancestors protected them from racial harm. Ancestral practices, like feeling one with your ancestors, are like a handshake across space time and maybe the multiverse. Yet, not ordinarily reading in science, I felt like I was going back into my child self mind, reworking lots of what I was taught in school, but in new ways and from a point of interest, like how some physicists have begun exploring how, in heightened states of awareness, like dreaming or creativity, consciousness may link to dimensions beyond perception, maybe even access to a multiverse. Classical physicists, for example, Classical physics, for example, challenge public norms of past, present, and future being entirely separate, but like African cosmology, for example, argues that what we call the now is imposed upon by a forever presence and the past. That takes us up to this paper, which is part four, and uses the Power Stone from the Infinity Stones and Marvel's version of Ragnarok as metaphors for how microaggressions break down our bodies, doing serious damage. And for me, looking at the detrimental impact of microaggressions on my family, friends, and colleagues, I'm looking at the effects of colonialism on a micro level. I turned to the silly archive of Marvel Entertainment, Ragnarok, and the Infinity Stones, and what they may allow us to imagine. In short terms, Marvel's interpretation of Ragnarok is loosely based on the Old Norse myth, and it is the destruction of Thor's homeworld, Asgard, and as in that, and also in that world, Marvel world, is seen as a fixed point in time. We may map Ragnarok as a metaphor for the ways microaggressions harm our bodies as a genocidal event within us that that do contribute to a biological breakdown of the human body. Human bodies are made up of organic molecules. So in the great dark of our bodies, there's organs, cells, flesh, and matter, and molecules, of course. Microaggressions might contribute to that. I came to use the term subatomic racism to describe the act of breakdown that Chester Pierce wrote about as microaggression as the noun. So subatomic racism is the adjective, and microaggression is the noun. So microaggression is used lots in racial terms, but was coined within Black context of psychiatry by Chester Pierce. It's also now used in areas like classism, ableism, and homophobia too, and many others. So before I continue, or before I talk about Ragnarok, I think it's best to also talk about the Infinity Stones as well. So six fictional cosmic objects that control the ways of being essential to the Marvel universe: time, space, reality, power, mind, and the soul. In James Gunn's 2015 science fiction fantasy film Guardians of the Galaxy, we are told by the collector that before creation itself, there were six singularities. When the universe exploded into existence and the remnants of the system were forged into concentrated ingots. These stones can only be brandished by beings of extraordinary strength. These carriers can use the stones to mow down entire civilizations like wheat in a field. Viewers are later told by sorcerers Wong and Doctor Strange in the Russo brothers' film Avengers Infinity War that at the dawn of the universe there was nothing then boom, the Big Bang sent six elemental crystals hurtling across the Earth universe. These Infinity Stones each control an essential aspect of existence: space, reality, power, soul, mind, and time. And I began to think, what if we thought about racial microaggressions that way as well? So the Power Stone is one of these six singularities in the MCU and was known as the Orb and represented the destructive nature of the universe. We might use the Orb as a metaphor for how microaggressions break down our bodies cellularly, flesh, bone, and compromise our immune systems, leaving them open to disease and other things. The Orb was used by the celestial Eson the Searcher to destroy planets, while in Guardians of the Galaxy we are told by Gamora that the stone reacts to anything organic. The bigger the target, the bigger the power surge. The stone was central to the evil plot of Kree warlord, Mad Titan Thanos, and his quest to collect all six Infinity Stones so he could become an all-ruling, omnipotent being in the universe. The orb was found by Star-Lord as well, on a mission to sell it before Ronan the Accuser could find it and use it. The quest for the Power Stone later involves the Guardians collaborating with the Nova Corps, attempting to stop it getting into the hands of Thanos. Yet it was Gamora's comment about the stone reacting with organic matter that made me think, and also Ragnarok as a metaphor for how microaggressions break down the organisms of our bodies. I began to think about the human body as almost like the universe inside us. As in the classic 1980 physics series Cosmos, physicist Carl Sagan tells us, the cosmos is also within us. We are made of star stuff, and we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. All living things on Earth are made of organic molecules, a complex microscopic architecture built around atoms of carbon. In the great dark between stars, there are also organic molecules in immense clouds of gas and dust. Inside such clouds, there are batches of new worlds forming. Their surfaces are very likely covered with organic molecules. So, when I use the term microaggression, I'm referring to those everyday acts of racism and possibly what they might do to our bodies. Black psychiatrist Chester Pierce coined that term in the 70s context of everyday anti-blackness happening in the United States. For Black people in the global West, they are the very everyday isms and schisms we have to deal with at work, school, on the street, and just in general everyday today life, including the assumptions of criminality, objectification, assumptions of intellectual inferiority, and the reduction of cultural values. Those everyday isms come attached to history. In Britain, we see this in the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade, further to things like Indian partition and the Kenya Asian crisis in the context of our South Asian colleagues too. I also looked to the 1919 uprisings, where we might view that what the media dubbed as race riots in port cities like Cardiff and Liverpool as white terror campaigns. They imitate more recent pogroms in August 2024, and the impact of these racist gestures live within our bodies. Writing from the United States, trauma psychotherapist and writer Resmond Manakem further tells us if the persistence of white supremacy in 21st century America surprises you, his book, My Grandmother's Hands, will give you a startlingly different understanding of why. You'll discover the vital force behind white supremacy is in our bodies, in our blood, literally, and in our nervous systems. It's the equivalent of a toxic chemical we ingest on a daily basis. Eventually, it changes our brains and the chemistry of our bodies. Further, for example, racial trauma very rarely starts with us or you. We carry the scars of our ancestors in our DNA, and we don't always break these cycles. And when we don't break these cycles, this may go on to impact the immune system. Scientists discovered years ago racism works at a cellular level, which I came to allegorize under subatomic racism. Now compound all of that over 400 years. Philosophy scholar and professor Desiree H. Melton confirms, as well, as long as racism shows no sign of abating, and it doesn't, the rational mind anticipates the assault, and the body's sympathetic nervous system plans for it by preparing us to fight or flee. The terror we have seen, the terror we've been able to escape for centuries. 400 years later, Black people continue to experience as well as anticipate daily assaults on their person and dignity. Arline Geronimus wrote about the racial weathering hypothesis in the early 90s to take stock of the health disparities of newborns and their mothers due to lifetimes of racism and other forms of violence as well, including class and what classism and racism can do together as we age as well. Marsh and colleagues also did 2 reviews on fibroids of Black American women. Racial weathering is known for explaining health outcomes based on exposure to racism. In March 2024, Black British beauty influencer Jessica Petway died from cervical cancer after being misdiagnosed with uterine fibroids. She told followers about her agonizing pain, and quotes their agonizing pain and intense vaginal bleeding, while doctors told her it was all fibroids. Petway was later diagnosed with stage 3 cervical cancer, and her death spotlights how Black women are misdiagnosed, where many are also dying early as well. Very much within Christina Sharp's theorizing of the wake as well, and I'll point you towards her book In the Wake on Blackness and Being as well. My friend Susanna Story told me about her experience of uterine fibroids here in the UK. Although Susanna is of Sri Lankan heritage and will be racialized as South Asian, she knows, like the US Black women, how racism shapes outcomes. In May 2019, Susanna gave birth to her son. And as part of post-delivery checkups, they did some scans. And when they did these scans, the doctors saw small fibroids in her uterus. They told her there was nothing to worry about. She believed them. Several months later, in February 2020, just before the COVID-19 outbreak, she got a job in London as a well-being manager at an education company where she was the only visibly not white person. During that time, this was also part of the Black Lives Matter protests, or the preamble as well. Although Susanna is not Black, she was facing questions at work about this, and the director of the company at the time removed the black square from the company Instagram account and gave the reason for doing this as they were not a political organization. And Susanna's white colleagues left her to challenge him, taking in the harm as well, taking all the risk and all the harm. It was constant and unrelenting. None of the white staff would call him out, despite being aware of it. So this experience left a sour taste and made Susanna target for her boss's discomfort, and ultimately what Robin DiAngelo coined as white fragility. Susanna came to be victim of racism, and she said, so I think that was when I started to notice I was getting really bad tummy aches. and I started to notice my periods were getting heavier. I went to the doctors because I thought, maybe it was a hernia or, maybe gastroenteritis, or it might be my pancreas, because there was a lot of pain there. Susanna went to the GP many times and was told it was probably constipation, and she didn't challenge it because at that time in 2020, which is now 5 years ago, she believed the doctors knew best. She started to see that she was gaining weight and producing a belly, and her periods were getting heavier. And this was early 2020, or still in the first half of 2020. When the pain got so severe, she went to A&E, so accident and emergency, at the hospital, and she had a CT scan, and they told her it might be hernia. The CT scan came back and said fibroids. She was referred to gynecology, where she had a number of other scans, which add 6 months to the timeline. So now, from the first pain in 2019, we're now a year and a half into this. By the time Susanna got seen properly, the tiny fibroids were now 22 centimeters, and the only option was now to have open surgery. White doctors often seem to think black and brown women have higher thresholds for pain, especially as they might not be crying in front of them and performing your pain in the ways they want, which is what Susanna was telling me about. The NHS often talk about don't take the pain of women like Susanna seriously, which is what happened when she was in labour as well with her second child. When I asked Susanna if she thought she would be taken more seriously if she was a white woman, she agreed she probably would have. But she also said that it's less common for white women to have fibroids, and one of the biggest triggers is the release of cortisol, the stress hormone, where black women, brown women, and others not racialized as white can often be taught to internalize that pain and not say anything. This may be why you see a greater development of things like fibroids and cysts in women not racialized as white. The point of accessing healthcare for them might be much later on too. So if white women are getting stress, they might be getting the support that they need much sooner than if you're a woman who is not white. I think as well, and this is based on Susanna's testimony, when you're growing up in a society, when you're taught to internalize things, you're taught to be tougher, and you're not allowed to be soft, and so on. Susanna's experience may also revisit the weathering hypothesis of Arline Geronimus. Susanna's in her late 30s and has experienced racism all her life. And while Black and Asian people experience racism differently, there is a shared commonality that leads to the early deaths via things like the healthcare system. So what history shows is that while many of these logics of violence start with Black people, they don't often end with us either. But Susanna's experience is just one person I talked to, and I'm not going to say that it's going to be the same for every single person. It's this experience. But I do know that amongst many Black women, this idea of medical gaslighting is pervasive when they go to access care in hospitals and so on. Sociologist Christina Sharp's book In the Wake, which I mentioned just a few moments ago, explores how Black life is shaped by the legacy of the Atlantic slave trade. It also explores not only how Black death is vital to US citizenship, but how Black suffering and somewhat death are vital to that experience in Europe and the Mediterranean too, including asylum seekers, the experience of asylum seekers. She uses wake work to claim space in a racist world, and furthermore as a metaphor for the path of Black suffering, trailing behind the slave ship, watching over the deceased, and coming to consciousness more so-called necessary Black deaths, being vital to systems of white racism. Living in the wake means living in the history and presence of terror at the ground of our everyday Black existence. Put another way, living in the wake means living and with terror in much of what passes public discourse about terror. We, black people, become the carriers of terror. This is everywhere clear as we think about those in the US who can weaponize sidewalks, Trayvon Martin, and shoot themselves while handcuffed, Victor White III, Travis Charter, Jesus Huerta, and more. Those black people transmigrating the African continent towards the Mediterranean and then to Europe who imagined as insects, swarms, vectors of disease, familiar danger, disaster, writes Sharp. Coming back to Marvel then, the all, for me, first in Guardians of the Galaxy and later in Avengers Infinity War, came to be a useful way for thinking about the destructive nature of racism can have upon the universe that is our bodies on the basis of biology. Remember, as Gamora says, that the stone reacts to anything organic. In Infinity War, Thanos steals the Power Stone from the Nova Corps, where it had been kept after the death of Ronan the Accuser 3 years earlier. He then uses it to torture Asgardian Thor, but Thanos' most notable use of it was using it to crush the moon of the planet Titan and hurl the pieces at his enemies. Thinking about this idea of universe, I come back to physicist Carl Sagan's TV program Cosmos, where he also continues to state, and this stayed with me, that the cosmos is also within us. We are made of star stuff, and we are a way for the cosmos to know itself. All living things on Earth are made of organic molecules, a complex microscopic architecture built around atoms of carbon. In the great dark between the stars, there are also organic molecules in immense clouds of gas and dust. Inside such clouds, there are batches of new worlds forming. Their surfaces are very likely covered with organic molecules, he says. Alternatively, we might also think about microaggressions upon the body in the context of our bodies being like space. We are made of star stuff. Should we take racial microaggressions as a product of capitalism? Then we could think about microaggressions as shards of violence that came from something big. For example, in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, historian Walter Rodney clearly argues how capitalism was made for racist reasons and how racism was made for capitalist reasons during the Atlantic slave trade, and how it got to a point where they couldn't be distinguished apart. If we thought about racial microaggressions as a product of that, we may see how small can still come at you like a bullet. Microaggressions via a subatomic racism could be thought as a genocide level event happening within us, the micro universes of our bodies, and the destruction upon the organic life that exists there, like Ragnarok. In the 2015 film Avengers Age of Ultron, Thor has a vision of all his friends dying around him that we now know to be Ragnarok, the end of Asgard. That vision sends him on a quest that in fact brought around Ragnarok. As in the later film Thor Ragnarok in 2017, viewers go on to witness the unavoidable genocide of the Asgardian people. In Marvel's version of Asgardian mythology, it is also a fixed point in time. Thor tells us, I've been having these terrible dreams of late, Asgard up in flames, falling to ruins, and you, Surtur, are at the center of all of them, and that's Surtur in the bottom picture there. Then you have seen Ragnarok, all of Asgard, says Surtur. The great prophecy, my time has come when my crown is reunited with the eternal flame. I shall be restored to my full might. I will tower over the mountains and bury my sword deep in Asgard's. I'm Asgard's doom, and so are you. All will suffer, all will burn. Okay, that's a bit on the nose, but you get the picture. So thinking about these microaggressions as a capitalist byproduct via the Atlantic slave trade, Ragnarok roughly translates as the doom of the god, and is the battle at the end of the world where gods and monsters die. The Marvel film version is a shadow of the original, but it might get us think of this world-ending event as a metaphor for how capitalism devours all it comes into contact with. In the words of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, capitalism requires inequality and racism enshrines it. That is where we begin. Is racism capitalism's only altar of difference? No, but that doesn't mean there is ever a moment in capitalism on a world stage or scale where the various institutions that sort and stack us into groups do not contribute to a group differentiated from nobility to premature death. That last phrase is my definition of racism, very much within Sharp's articulation of the wake, remember as well. And capitalism requires differentiation in order for it to realize its imperative, which is always to make money more. Microaggressions or racial microaggressions then may be considered as the shards of capitalist violence that splinter into the bodies of black and brown people, compromising the immune system and contributing to our biological breakdown. So when Carl Sagan in his 1980s series Cosmos describes the body as a universe made of star stuff, I find this very, very useful in thinking about how bodies might fight or succumb to disease left open by racism. When we know exposure to racism compromises the immune system, we might think how disease in black spaces for some, for lack of a better term, is an open goal, where in a world where early black death is a requirement for white supremacy to sustain itself. Our bodies burning in the metaphorical sense like stars in space, like Asgard, brought along by Ragnarök. Astronomers would describe a supernova as a star that increases in brightness due to an explosion that has disposed of its mass, most of its mass. I came to think about how some may say cancer patients may undergo several operations to get the disease, so to speak. While racism does not cause cancer, it does impact access to treatment and diagnosis. Chronic stress also impacts the body's ability to fight disease, including but not limited to stress caused by persistent and unrelenting racism affecting our organs, molecules, and matter in the great dark, as Sagan says, of our bodies. Our bodies are made of star stuff, and that star stuff for black people is under threat by the legacies of racism in the wake of the slave ship. Metaphors of the Power Stone as an organism killing object and Ragnarök as a genocide level event come to be useful images to describe how there is a universe inside us, subject to so much violence where society and environment exploit, for lack of a better term, the open goal left by legacies of violence, including racism, but not exclusively. Angela Saini's book Inferior discusses how women experience more pain than men, explained in conversation with biologist Steve Orstad. Women's immune systems have survived events that have killed the equivalent men. Thus, today's men statistically, in comparison, don't survive. Saini, in conversation with Catherine Sandberg, the latter also discusses the double-edged blade of women's immune systems, whilst being strong and more open to autoimmune disease, as well. Whilst I'm a sociologist, not a biologist, I'm really interested in what images we can conjure of how we experience outside effects, how we experience outside effects of our insides. We might consider how the after effects of these encounters live in the body at a scale tinier than a virus, pushing the walls of everything that allows the body to fight sickness, possibly even at a scale at a millionth of an inch, very much within Stephen Hawking's idea of quantum mechanics. What I came to describe as subatomic racism builds on terms like microaggression and the weathering hypothesis, and it's the love child of quantum mechanics, science fiction, and sociology, particularly critical whiteness studies and critical race theory. The way racial inequalities are currently studied at least in the mainstream, largely only considers the physical realm. What the Marvel Infinity Stones allow me to do is use those comics or cosmic singularities as metaphors for the ways microaggressions impact us beyond the body. So this paper focused on the Power Stone and the ways racism impacts the organic universe in our bodies. However, other papers also included or looked at how the effects of racism on the spirit, as I did via the Soul Stone and Guy Debord's psychogeography. 6 papers for 6 stones, and considered these ideas together shows the devastating multi-pronged impact microaggressions may have across several dimensions. These films meshed with social science, allow me to go deeper, learn more, and really thinking about life itself. In the words of the ancient one, Dr. Strange, we don't get to choose our time. Death is what gives life meaning. To know your days are numbered, your time is short. And thanks very much for listening. And as always, with all these papers, if you've got questions and so on, drop me an email at tradeventour.com/contact, or you can leave a comment on the video as well. Thank you.